Hello and welcome back. We're fresh from coding that web page we just did a few moments ago, and it was great. We put all of our skills to use and we made that web page, but there are a few things in it that, you know, kind of highlighted that we still need some more skills. We need to learn some more HTML and more CSS. So one of the issues that we saw in that web page was, do you remember the image size was a set pixel width? And so when the screen size got smaller, the image got cut off. So I'm going to show you that same thing, but in this really simple HTML file that I've got in front of you. I've got rid of all that code from the exercise, and my body now is literally just an image inside just a very generic div called parent, okay, which just has a grey background. So let's see what that looks like on the screen, and this is it. It's just an image inside a div that has a grey background. And this can show you the problem of what's going on. Let's just resize my browser. Now I've made the image 1000 pixels, which is fine because I'm working with about 1400 pixels on my computer. But the moment I get down to less than 1000 pixels, the image gets cut off, and that's not great at all. So we need to change that. And there's different ways we can do this, but pretty much the thing you need to remember is that pixels are good, but everyone's screens are different size pixels. So as I said, my screen here is about 1400 pixels, but you might be looking at it on a mobile phone where you only have like 500 pixels, or maybe you've got a massive monitor with like 4000 pixels or whatever. So because everyone's screens are different, you need to make sure that the design and the code works on all screen sizes. So if I come back to my code, I don't really want to be using pixels for images because, as we've seen, it doesn't work. So what other options do we have available to us? And there are a few different ones available to us, and I'll show you 3 in this video. So one of the things we can use is we can just forget pixels. We can stop using them, and we can use something called view width. Now this is cool because it resizes the image based on the available space on your view width. So it's actually the viewport width. So this is the viewport. It's kind of the available space you have to look at things on the internet. So my view width, as I said, is about 1400 pixels. And in my CSS, I just changed the width of this image, not 1000, that doesn't make sense, to 100 VW, or 100% of the viewport width. So what that means is if I refresh the page, my image now is going to take up the whole width of the viewport. So let's see what that looks like. Let's refresh the page, and there we go. By using 100 VW, the image now is taking up 100% of the viewport width, so all the way from the left over to the right. And what you'd expect is if I change that to, let's say, 50 VW, then it's going to take up 50% of the view width, and there we go. It's now only taken up half. And I could go down to 1 view width or 5 view width. I can do whatever I want. Let's go down to 5, and now it goes really small. But the idea is, depending on how much space you've got in your browser, your viewport width depends on how small the image is going to go. So that's one way of kind of making your images responsive. So let's just go back up to 50, so at least we can see the image, and I'll refresh it. And there we go, 50% of the viewport width. Now that's great. Now if we can work with the viewport width, we also can work with the viewport height. So all you need to do there is change the W to an H. And now what you're doing is you're working not with the viewport width, but with the viewport height. So if I've got 50 VH, it means that the width of this image is going to be half of the viewport height. And in some instances you might want to do that so that, you know, as the browser size or the viewport size gets smaller in height, then the width of the image gets smaller. So, you know, there might be instances where you want to use that, but just know that we can actually create sizes not based on pixels, but on the available space that the user has in front of them. So that's one way we can make sure that these images don't get cut off. Now there's a third way we can be responsive. Remember, we've just gone over viewport width, which is great, and then the viewport height. But the one that you'll probably end up using more is actually percent, because this one is actually it's a little bit more tricky, but it's a little bit more kind of dynamic and useful. So what happens with percentage is you would have thought, if this is the first time you're seeing this, you would have thought, right, I'm making my image 100% width. So you'd expect that the image now is going to be 100% of the viewport width. But we're not really working with the viewport width anymore. When we say 100%, what we mean is 100% of whatever this image is inside of. So I told you earlier that this image is inside of a parent div. It's a div with a class called parent. So depending on how wide this div is, depends on how wide this image is going to be. So if I've put the width to 100%, then this image is going to be 100% of the width of the parent. It's pretty much going to be exactly the same width. Whereas if I had changed the width to 50%, then the image is going to be half of the width of whatever the parent is. So it's kind of relative, and that's really useful, because imagine if you've created, a section of on your web page that's just like a box in the middle of the page. You can say the image is going to go all the way to the edges of that container, or is it going to be maybe half of it? So it's all kind of relative to the parent, which is really useful. So in my situation, I haven't shown you yet the width of the parent. So let's see how big the parent is. Now the parent is 100% of the view width. So if we look at that in the browser, I can see here that my parent div, which is the one with the grey background, is 100% of the view width. Brilliant. And what I've said here is that the image is 50% of that. So 50% of 100% view width is 50 view width, is 50% of the view width. So I can change this now. What if I change the parent to only be 50 view width? Then what that means is the grey background now is not going to be full width. It's only going to be half of the width. And I know that the image is 50%, so it's half of whatever the parent is. Hopefully that's making sense. It can be a little bit tricky the first time you hear it, but just think of it as I get to choose the width of my image, and I've chosen it to be a percentage, and a percentage means the percentage of the parent. So by changing the width of the parent, you end up changing the width of the child of the image. So just one last time, if I change this parent width back to 100 of the viewport width, the image is only 50% of it, so that means it's going to be half of the viewport width. And so there we go. There's 3 ways you can make sure that your images are responsive. And the thing is, it's not limited to just images. You could change like font sizes using this. So let's just do that pretty quickly. If I type something in here, just in my div, I tell you what, let's get rid of the image and just type something here. Let's put hello world, which is our classic hello world. And then it always needs the exclamation mark at the end. If I was to, let's get rid of the CSS for the image because we don't need that anymore. And if I save this and refresh it, then all I have is just a bit of random text in my div that says hello world. But I haven't said how big this font size needs to be. So if I come up to the parent and I start styling it, I say, right, the font size is, if we just start with pixels for the moment, if I say it's 200 pixels and I save this, then there we go. That is 200 pixels. Brilliant. But what I can do is I can say, well, the font size, I want it to actually be kind of 10% of the view width. So the font size isn't now working in pixels, it's working relative to the viewport width that I have available to me, and it's going to be 10% of whatever the viewport width is. So I'll save that and I'll refresh the page. And so now that font size is 10% of the viewport width. So if I reduce the viewport width, then the font size is going to reduce too, which is great because you might want that as the screen size gets smaller, the font size gets smaller. So that's great. And then also, remember, I can use percentage if I want, or view height. But the idea here is that whenever you use pixels, that's great. But just remember, if you're working with responsive screens, which we all should be doing, then pixels will only get you so far. Maybe the better idea is to use view width, view height, or percentage. There are a couple of other things you can do that we'll save for a later video, but those are the 3 simple ways to make sure that all of the things on screen are able to be responsive.